make sure that everyone is let in. And nice to see everybody here today. My name is Hamish Chalmers. I'm one of the co-directors of the Oxford Education Deanery, who is hosting this event this evening with our good friends and colleagues at the Qatar Foundation International. Today's webinar is entitled Exploring a Guide to Researching Arabic as an Additional Language. And we have two excellent presenters today in Dr. Anna-Maria Ramezanzadeh and Dr. Robert Woore, who have been focusing on this area of inquiry for some time now. Throughout the course of the session, you will hear about the evolving field of research into the learning and teaching of Arabic as an additional language. We'll provide an overview of the current landscape of Arabic research, discussing key gaps in the field and priority areas for future research identified by stakeholders, the people who we do our research for. I just want to give you a couple of housekeeping notes. The webinar is being recorded. Your microphones and video cameras are turned off by default, or should be. If you find that your microphone turns on for some reason, please turn it off. Otherwise, we have 100 or so people all making noise at the same time, and that's no good. There will be moments during the presentations today where Robert and Anna-Maria will be asking you to suggest things in the chat. We also have the Q&A system, and you can put questions that you want to pose to our two presenters today in the Q&A, and that, just so that you know, is anonymous, so your name doesn't appear on that. If we make the recording available after the event, i.e. to rewatch, we will make sure that nobody's names are available, and chat comments and so on will not be seen, but our presenters may be repeating them or rephrasing them for the general audience to listen to. So I think that's it. We've got 2 hours of fascinating insights into teaching, researching Arabic as an additional language. And like I say, please feel free to use the Q&A, which is at the top of your Teams window. You'll see a speech bubble with a question mark in it. Use that, please, rather than the chat to pose questions to our presenters. The chat for when they ask you to suggest things to them. Okay, so with no further ado, I would like to hand over to Anna-Maria and Robert. Enjoy the event.
Thank you very much, Hamish. Anna-Maria, are you going to share? Oh,
yes.
That already is shared.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay, well, welcome everybody, and thank you very much for coming. It's great to have you here. So Hamish has already done a bit of an introduction. What we're hoping to do in the next couple of hours is provide some advice and guidance on how to conduct high quality but also relevant research into teaching and learning Arabic as an additional language. So I really count myself very lucky to have been able to work with Anna-Maria in this area over a few years now, actually, on a number of projects. And I suppose our driving ambition really is to expand the teaching and learning of Arabic in schools. Fundamentally, we would want any expansion of teaching, if it's going to be successful, to be underpinned by a sound evidence base, by sound research-based understanding of what effective teaching and learning looks like in this language and in other languages. We just want to say a big thank you to Qatar Foundation International, who've supported our work and supporting this webinar, and also Oxford Education Deanery for organising and hosting the webinar. So Anna-Maria, if you go on to the next one, please, thank you. So this is our outline of what we're hoping to do. We've divided it roughly into 2-hour-long blocks. In the first half, we're going to talk about a scoping review, which we conducted to try and get a picture of the existing research in this area. Following on from that, we're going to report on a PSP, a priority setting partnership project, which was actually inspired by some of Hamish's work, where we worked with stakeholders to find out what do teachers and policymakers and school leaders, what would they like to know about from research in this area. Then after the break, we're going to focus on some of the features of high quality research, drawing on an in-depth systematic review that we did in this area. And then hopefully there'll be a bit of time at the end for Q&A as well. So what we hope you'll leave this afternoon with after the next couple of hours is a clearer understanding of what research has already been done in Arabic. Secondly, what practitioners and policymakers see as the key areas for future research. And then thirdly, what some of the hallmarks are of high quality and rigorous research, which we then hope will enable our work, your work, to produce high quality, valid findings, which then can make an impact on classroom practice and policy. So I'm going to hand over to Anna-Maria now just to talk briefly about the importance of Arabic, why it's an important language to learn, and also what makes it interesting from a research perspective. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm sure everyone in attendance here today knows that Arabic is a language of global importance and is significant both culturally, politically, and religiously. But just to give an overview of some of the reasons that Arabic does have that level of importance, it is one of the UN's official 6 official languages. It is also the official language of over 20 countries, spanning the Middle East and North Africa, and is spoken by over 400 million native speakers. And in addition, it is the liturgical language, so the language used for accessing religious texts and the performing of religious rituals by over 2 billion Muslims worldwide. In the context of the UK, which is the context that myself and Robert work in particular, Arabic has been ranked as one of the top 5 languages of crucial importance for the UK's future in terms of its prosperity, security, and influence. And this has led to calls for the diversification of current language provision in the UK, particularly at the school level, to push provision beyond the traditional big 3 languages, so those being French, Spanish, and German. And these calls have sort of been amplified in the wake of Brexit, which has obviously informed perceptions of Europe and uptake of European languages over the past few years. So there is, as we know, a rising demand for Arabic teaching, both in the UK and worldwide. And in this case, we're talking about the learning of Arabic as an additional language, so learning Arabic as a second language or a foreign language in particular. But we believe that this expansion needs to be underpinned by rigorous evidence as to how the language can be effectively learned and taught. So the question is, where can we get this evidence from? Now, obviously, we can draw on wider language learning research to apply and understand universal principles, perhaps, for language learning. But we also need to bear in mind that there are features of Arabic that make it distinct from other languages, and those require exploration. So what is it that makes Arabic distinct? Firstly, there is a sort of perceptual issue. Arabic is seen as a very difficult language. I'm sure you've come across this perception in your classrooms and amongst people who haven't even necessarily learned the language, but have sort of heard this, I want to call it a rumor, but there is an element of truth to it. It is classified as a Category 4 language by the Foreign Service Institute in the United States. So it's up there with languages such as Japanese and Korean. And it's deemed to be a super hard language, specifically for native English speakers to learn. So what does that mean in practical terms? It means that it requires more time for learners to gain proficiency in Arabic than it would in other languages such as French or Spanish or German, or even non-European languages such as Turkish. So why does Arabic require more time to learn? Well, one of the issues is that it is from a completely different language family to English, and as such, it shares few cognates. There is little lexical overlap, so few shared vocabulary items between English and Arabic. So English speakers who are learning the language can't necessarily rely on their existing knowledge when it comes to vocabulary, as they might be able to do in, let's say, French, Spanish, or German. So the word for school in Arabic is madrasa, as you will probably know. And this clearly shares no linguistic root with the word for school in English or any of these European languages. But as you'll notice, I've put the word twice, and that is because there is also the issue of the writing system of Arabic. So this refers to two things that present challenges for learners. Firstly, the script is obviously completely different. It is written from right to left. It's also cursive, so it's always written joined up, and the letters can vary in their form depending on whether they're at the beginning, middle, or at the end of the word, or if they're written independently. But in addition to that, there is the feature of diacritics, which presents an additional layer of complexity when it comes to learning and teaching the language. So in most sort of mainstream modern standard Arabic texts, you will find the script written without diacritics. But the question sort of posed to language teachers is, at what point should those diacritics, if at all, be introduced, and at what point should they be removed? This is a feature of the language that requires, again, investigation that may not apply to other languages. In terms of motivation, Arabic is also distinct. So we've also already mentioned that the language is learned by at least part of the population of that 2 billion Muslims around the world. And many learners we find bring motivations that are linked to religion to the classroom. And we don't find this to be a feature of language learning in many other languages. There is some overlap with Hebrew, some overlap with Sanskrit, which are also scripts used for religious texts. But this wouldn't apply necessarily to learning French, for example, or at least certainly not to the same degree. We also have the issue of heritage language learners. Now, obviously, this is a feature of language learning classrooms, regardless of the language being learned. But when it comes to Arabic, this is complicated to some degree by the existence of multiglossia. So heritage learners, the language that they bring to the classroom may not overlap with what is being taught. Now, we've chosen to use the term multiglossia. You may have heard in the past the term diglossia, which is the term coined by Ferguson, I think in 1959, to refer to multiple varieties. He had it categorized as two varieties, a higher variety that's used in formal contexts and a lower, it's a problematic term, but a lower variety used for colloquial language. We've opted for the term multiglossia because we think it's slightly more complicated than just the existence of two varieties. In Arabic, we have three strands, at the very least, that we can sort of distinguish from each other. These being classical Arabic, modern standard Arabic, and the colloquial variant. Now, we have sort of differentiated between these three strands, but in reality, they exist along a spectrum, and the borders between them are very porous. So you will find in colloquial speech, for example, that it may be peppered with classical phrases or modern standard phrases, that people who are accessing classical texts may use colloquial language to explain them. So although we've demarcated them as distinct, in authentic situations of Arabic language use, learners will find multiple varieties being used. But each of these varieties have different domains of usage in general, and they are learned by different populations in different contexts and are manifest through different skills. So this relates back to motivation in the sense that learners may bring different understandings of the language and different drives to learn different varieties of the language to the classroom. However, despite this variety amongst learners, the variety that is predominantly taught in classrooms, as I'm sure you'll be aware, is the modern standard variety. And there is what has been termed an open secret in the Arabic teaching profession, that the language taught in the classroom is not the same as that used in speech. So this is an issue that is pretty distinct to Arabic, and one that is certainly food for thought and an area for research. And I'll hand back over to Robert.
Thank you very much, Anna-Maria. So for the next sort of 15-20 minutes, we're going to tell you about the scoping review which we conducted. And I know some people in the audience, I can see from some of the names, have seen this at least once before. but I hope it's new to a number of people at least. So we wanted to get a map of the landscape. This was one of our first steps, really, to find out what has already been done and where the gaps are. So, yeah, if you move on, please, Anna-Maria. Only one of us can click. So our scoping review sought to conduct a systematic search to identify and categorize all existing research to date on Arabic as an additional language. And that was as of February 23. I mean, these things go out of date quite quickly, but I'll talk about that in a couple of slides' time. The aim is to use objective methods that can be replicated. So we have a protocol which can be found online. And as I said, the idea is to get a picture of what has been done so far, and crucially also to identify the gaps. And our aim was to signpost for teachers who might want to say, find out about existing research on motivation for Arabic, or teaching of learning strategies, or teaching of phonics, or whatever it is. They would know where to go to look for it, and that researchers would also be able to find previous work in order to build on it, avoid reinventing the wheel, and see where the gaps are, see what still needs doing. Okay, so our overarching question was, what is the extent and nature of empirical evidence published in English on teaching and learning Arabic as an additional language? And we've put in the English language in red, because I'm sure immediately some people will think, well, why? What about other languages, and specifically what about Arabic? In our original protocol, I think the version that's online actually, it does include, we did try to include Arabic language literature as well, but it proved too difficult to do in the time available for practical reasons, really, the nature of the databases and their functionality. So that remains a piece of work to be done. But having said that, clearly a vast amount of academic research is published in English. So our sub-questions then were, where have studies been published? Just reveal all these. Which topics have been researched? Thank you. Oh, thank you. Which topics, in which contexts have studies been conducted, and which methodological approaches have been used. So, in terms of our results, our initial searches gave rise to a large number of returns, so getting on for 8,000. Some, of course, we searched in multiple databases, so some of those were duplicates. By the time we removed the duplicates, we had 5,000, and we then looked at the titles and abstracts and checked whether they really met our inclusion criteria. And is this really a piece of empirical work looking at the teaching and learning of Arabic as a foreign or second language? Some of those we both did, and we compared our ratings in order to give an indicator of reliability, and our judgments were highly reliable. So that brought us down to 1,000 records. And of those, we then accessed the full texts and checked again, do they really meet our criterion? And that brought us down then to 758. So the first thing to note is that is a large number. There's quite a lot out there already. Okay, now those 758 studies were lovingly entered by Anna-Maria into this mega database, of which you can see the top left-hand corner here. But this is, of course, 758 rows long, and it's 50-something columns wide. It's got all kinds of information in there, like, for example, the first language of the participants, their age, the setting, whether it's a school or university, the kind of methods that were used, and so on. So we hope this is a really useful database. You can see it also contains the abstracts and the links, clickable links to the articles. So we hope this is useful, and that is available on the QFI website. Obviously, the QR code is from a live presentation. But yeah, if you go to the website and search in the research area, you should find that database. Okay, thank you. But just now we're going to give you just a snapshot of what is in that database. First of all, as you might expect, the majority of entries are journal articles, about 60% of them. There's also quite a lot of dissertations, master's dissertations and doctoral dissertations, and a few other kinds of publication too. The journal articles are spread across 210 different journals. So actually there's not a very clear, they're scattered. So it's not that clear where you would go to look for research on Arabic. There were, however, a couple of journals where there were more than others. The Foreign Language Annals, so the Active journal, and then, as you'd expect, Al-Arabiya. Okay, in terms of sort of trends over time, you can see there's been this really rapid, probably exponential growth in publications. We should say we did a similar exercise in Chinese a few years ago, and it actually had a similar curve. So I don't think this sort of exponential growth is really unique to Arabic. It might be second language acquisition research generally, or possibly research generally, but it is growing rapidly. And currently we're working with Emily Zuniga, who's helping us, or who is updating this database with us. And in the last couple of years, so since we completed it and the current time, that's given rise to another 231 entries after the abstract screening. So it looks like that kind of trend is continuing. And so, yeah, we hope with QFI's help to make sure this is updated periodically so that it remains an up-to-date resource. Okay, we're going to ask you to do something a bit interactive now, just so I'm not talking all the time. And one of our categories in the database is the kind of skill area, skill or knowledge area. So if Anna-Maria, if you do just reveal those categories, if we ask you which one of these, if you don't mind typing this in the chat, if you're happy to, just which of those do you think has been most frequently addressed in research on Arabic as an additional language? If I just give you 30 seconds or so, and hopefully some answers will appear in the chat. And if you click on the sort of speech bubble near the top, you should see the chat. So I've got speaking, writing, vocab, speaking, grammar. It's a bit hard to gauge which is the most frequent here. Mm. Okay. Is anyone else still typing, or shall I summarize at this point? We've got quite a few people who put speaking, a few people who put writing, a few people who put Hamish, thank you. You just created a poll. Let's do that for the next one. Cultural competence. Okay, that's interesting because quite a lot of people have put speaking. So when we did this with a live audience and we used like a polling app, actually grammar came out as by far the most frequent category. It looks like here there are some grammars and there's some writing, but most people have put speaking. And in fact, so thank you so much for typing in your answers. And Anna-Maria will now reveal. In fact, speaking was overwhelmingly the most frequently investigated topic. But you can see there were a good number of studies on these other areas, but speaking was way out ahead. Okay, now another question, next question for the chat is, in terms of more specific topics, so for example, I don't know, learner strategies or motivation, what key topics would you expect to have been addressed? So again, if you don't mind just sharing your ideas in the chat. So this one's open-ended. It's anything you think might have been investigated. I'm not seeing any. I'm not seeing any answers appearing yet. There we go. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Multiglossia. So we've got a few relating to multiglossia. Life situations, that's an interesting one. Disfluency, motivation, speaking and writing. Okay, so if we show you how we classified, how we categorized the topics which were researched. There we go. So we categorize the topics into broader categories. Thank you. With the difference between what we teach and what real life is, that's beautifully put. And so again, perhaps relating to multiglossia. So the categories, the most frequent category was affective factors, and that comprised things like motivation, anxiety, attitude, self-efficacy. So these are quite broad categories. You can see pedagogy was also right up there as one as a frequent topic. But though you can see from this list, if you scan down it, there's a broad range of topics being looked at. Okay, our next question was, what varieties of the language have been explored? And the most striking thing immediately, I think, about this chart is the red column on the right, that 40% of the sources we included in the review didn't actually tell us. And we did look carefully through the full text, and nowhere does it say actually what variety of the language is being taught. Of the remaining 60%, the majority of those state that they're looking at MSA, as you would probably expect. And some of them looked at MSA and a dialect. You see classical variety much less represented in research. But we certainly felt that it was an omission that many studies didn't actually state what was being taught in the classroom. Okay, in terms of geographical location, this is interesting. Where has research been done? Now, this isn't where the authors are based. This is where the research was conducted, where the participants are, so where the study was conducted. Again, there's a very clear category which is much more frequent than the others, and that's research conducted in the USA. Getting on for 45% of studies were done in the US. You can see, okay, Malaysia is second, which you might expect Malaysia to rank highly, but it's far, far less represented than the United States. So again, there's large areas here of the map which are blank, and so another issue perhaps is the geographical spread of where the research is being done. Okay, in terms of, thank you. In terms of sort of age group that has been investigated, we found again, this is probably in common with other areas of second language acquisition research, but an overwhelming majority, 80-something%, I think that is, if you click Anna-Maria, I think it gives us a percent, or 70% of studies looking at adults. And that means, so for someone like me, who's really interested in school-age learners, I used to be a school teacher of languages, and I research school classrooms, actually there's a huge category of people there, younger learners, who are not really represented in the research evidence. So this is another clear gap in the literature, which is looking at younger learners, because younger learners are likely to differ in certain ways compared to adult learners. Not least motivation. If you click again on Maria a couple of times, the majority of adult learners were in university. So there's clearly going to be a difference in terms of motivation between adult learners who've opted to study this at university and perhaps people in classrooms who are studying it because they have to at a much younger age. So there's a gap in the literature there. Okay, next please. Yeah, okay, in terms of methodological approaches, quantitative studies predominated, and within those, most of them were either exploratory designs in our categorization or descriptive. Descriptive, by that we mean they report percentages, 20% of learners scored this or thought this, whereas exploratory, that's where we called that, we're not quite sure that's the right label, but it's to do with relationships between variables. So for example, a correlation between, say, working memory and a reading outcome. So what there isn't so much of is experimental studies here, where particular approaches to teaching might be evaluated. In the qualitative category, surveys were the most common. So overwhelmingly, the majority of qualitative studies gave a survey and reported on the findings. Okay, so to conclude from all this, that was just a whiz through that database, and the full report is available on QFI's website. But in summary, first of all, there's quite a lot out there, and there is rapid growth, and a fairly broad range of topics have been researched. Affective factors are the most frequent, but certainly there's a range of other areas being looked at, and motivation would be an example of affective factors. There's been a range of research methods, but quantitative studies predominate, and those are mainly descriptive and exploratory studies. And the focus has tended to be on MSA where identified, but quite a lot of studies don't tell us which variety they're looking at. There's been a focus on adult learners, mainly in higher education and mainly in the USA. So there's clearly a sort of concentration here, and there's an imbalance in the research evidence, biased towards adult learners at university in the USA, Learning Modern Standard. So there's a question there in the chat, are these findings based on AL2 or AFL? We covered both. We've got a slide actually. Perhaps we'll come back to that question in just a second and we'll share a slide. In terms of gaps in the research, the gaps to us seem to be younger learners, different varieties of the language, a need for experimental studies evaluating different approaches, which we'll focus on in the second half, and the different educational settings in which Arabic is being learned beyond university, and also filling in some of these geographical gaps. We have got a slide just to address that question straight away. I think it's about number 8, is it, Anna-Maria? 9. We had it hidden.
I can unhide it. Perhaps if we start with that after the break.
Oh, it's okay.
One way to do it.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Okay, so that's the end of the scoping review presentation. So I'm going to hand over to Anna-Maria now to tell us about the PSP.
Okay, thank you. So you now know or have a good idea of what the current landscape of Arabic research looks like, but what might the future of Arabic language research look like? In order to sort of determine where Arabic research might be heading or might be best advised to expand, we conducted a priority setting partnership looking into the research of Arabic as an additional language. And the aim of this particular study was to establish priorities for new research by asking and engaging stakeholders in the learning and teaching of Arabic what they consider to be the most pressing areas for focus. So this particular project was modelled on a PSP conducted by Hamish Chalmers, Vedra Faitaki and Victoria Murphy at the Department of Education, who looked into the context of EAL research, so English as an additional language. So we modelled our particular project on their very successful study, and we consulted with researchers, teachers, administrators and policymakers to engage them in the process of determining what these priority areas might be. And we carried out this particular project in order to facilitate and encourage what is known as close to practice research. So close to practice research is defined by the engagement of practitioners, so stakeholders, in the process of shaping research questions that will be relevant to their own day-to-day practice, their own sort of real-life work in the classroom or sort of in schools in which Arabic is taught. And this often involves collaborative work between researchers and practitioners, not necessarily in carrying out the actual research, but as we said, in shaping that research agenda. And this is sort of the opposite of the ivory tower image of research. We were talking about this earlier, where researchers are sort of on the outside of the learning process and the teaching process, looking in, setting their own agendas and sort of prescribing perhaps things from this kind of outside elevated position where learners and teachers are not necessarily engaged. Now, that's not to say that researchers can't set their own research agendas, but the point of this particular project was to try and facilitate this close to practice research. So how did we conduct our priority setting partnership? This was done in 2 phases. The first was the generation of a survey, which we called the Oxford Collaboration for Arabic Research Survey. You may have completed this. If you did, thank you very much. And we disseminated this survey globally. We asked participants to tell us what they thought were important questions that research should answer in relation to 8 different areas. So different learner levels, beginner, intermediate and advanced, what research questions should be answered regarding these different levels of learners. Questions in regard to heritage language learners, different skill areas, so reading, writing, speaking, listening, cultural competence, grammar and vocabulary. What research needs to be done in the area of motivation to learn Arabic as an additional language, so as we've said, as a foreign language or a second language, or a heritage language indeed. What questions or what should research address in terms of multiglossic approaches to teaching Arabic? And finally, what questions do they think should be answered in relation to assessment? We received quite a lot of responses in terms of the individual questions that that were sent back to us, and we distilled those questions into a series of distinct theme headings under which we listed the questions, sort of removing any overlapping questions. So who responded to this survey? We had 75 responses in total, and these sort of spanned quite a broad geographic area. A lot of responses did come from the United States, which is understandable. There are many institutions there that offer Arabic as a foreign language or a second language, or Arabic as an additional language, let's call it. But we had responses from Australia, from places in Europe, from in the Middle East, obviously responses from the UK as well. Who were these participants? So the majority were, well, a large proportion were Arabic teachers, and about a third were Arabic researchers. We also had responses from policymakers, participants in positions of management and administration. So, for example, head teachers of schools that are offering Arabic, and also people who fit into other categories, such as former language teachers or those involved in the marking of Arabic assessments, for example, for exam boards. And these were the themes that were generated as a result of that first survey. As you can see, they're very broad, although Multiglossia did generate the highest number of questions, with 111 questions once we distilled them down and removed any overlapping questions. But this encompassed a sort of, like I said, a broad range of issues. So the integration of technology into language learning, the issue of translanguaging, obviously the various skills, language skills, the issue of inclusive teaching in diverse classrooms, parental involvement in the learning process, a wide array of interesting themes emerged. So what happened next? So phase 2 was conducted at the Oxford QFI Forum, and I think we have people here who attended that forum, so welcome back. But this is this was the first of its kind, and we hosted an event that brought together teachers, researchers, and policymakers in order to collaborate and discuss the landscape of Arabic research and to gain insights from each other. So in the forum, participants were asked to individually rate the questions that we had generated as a result of that first survey in order of importance. So whether they were of low importance or high importance or of moderate importance. We then took those individual rankings and extracted the top 10 rated, the top 25 rated questions. We then asked participants to discuss these 25 questions in small groups. I think we had about 8 groups. So in those small groups, they were asked to identify which of these top 25 questions would they rank as the top 10 and in which order. We collected their rankings from each group, and we collated those into a final top 10 priority research questions. So what were these questions? Drum roll. So question 1 is perhaps something that we didn't expect, or certainly I didn't expect to be the top rated question, but it is very interesting and tells you something perhaps about the sort of landscape of teaching as well as research. So question 1 regards teacher development and what approaches to teacher development are effective for teachers of Arabic. Question 2 related to assessments, and not just what assessments might be fair, inclusive, and reliable, but what might be reliable, inclusive, fair, and valid for learners of diverse backgrounds. So rather than having perhaps one test that caters to all learners, is it necessary that we test learners in different ways? That could be a research question that aligns with this particular priority question. Question 3 related to multiglossic approaches to teaching Arabic, not just what might an approach look like, but what might an effective approach look like? What might a multiglossic approach that delivers on enhancing learner proficiency in multiple varieties look like in a classroom? Question 4 related to the instruction materials and making sure that they are appropriate for learners of different levels within the same classroom. So this sort of overlaps with the issue of diversification of content in lessons. Often language classrooms, as I'm sure you're aware, will have learners of varying different levels of proficiency and exposure. So how can we ensure that materials that we're using are appropriate for those different learners in the same classroom? Question number 5 related to heritage learners. In particular, how we develop their positive sense of identity through Arabic learning. Number 6 was related to strategies, so learner strategies. Which strategies can learners use in relation to different skills, reading, writing, speaking, and listening, to promote the development of their proficiency in these different areas? Number 7 was an interesting question and asks how students or learners can be encouraged to use Arabic inside and outside of the classroom. So this perhaps aligns with sort of what pedagogical approaches or what strategies can teachers use to boost the actual use of Arabic, not just through curriculum materials perhaps, but through maybe extracurricular activities or various different methods to engage learners in the use of Arabic beyond the classroom wall. Number 8 referred to the resources that are available, and not just their availability in the teaching context, but how effective different resources are. So resources can relate to online platforms, textbooks, various different teaching materials. So where do they exist? Do they cater for to students of different backgrounds? And how effective are they? Number 9 related to students' motivation and the factors that influence, generate, and sustain that motivation to study Arabic. So at all phases of the learning process, both before learners enter the classroom, whilst they're in the classroom, and once they've completed a particular course or module or year at school, how they might then continue that motivation beyond their particular course. And finally, how can critical cultural competence be taught effectively to different categories of learners? So beyond just teaching language skills such as reading, writing, listening, how can we boost effectively learners' critical cultural competence in the classroom and perhaps even beyond? Okay. I think we are going to pause there. Am I right? And
yeah, that's right. We're going to have some Q&A time.
Yes.
To take us up to a break. So we've got the first question there from Luma in the chat. Are these findings based on AL2 or AFL? So can you just find that slide? And yeah, we'll just speak to that. It was actually quite tricky to decide which studies we would include and which categories of learners. I can't see it at the minute anyway.
Sorry, here we go. Getting there. Sorry, 1 minute.
Okay.
Okay, here we go. Right.
Yeah. Shall I speak to this then to start with? So, yeah, we did struggle a bit to decide who should be included, which kinds of populations of learners should be included, and also what to call it. And you know, we decided on the term Arabic as an additional language to try to be inclusive. Actually, there are some negative associations with foreign language, for one thing, but we did so it included learners who would traditionally be called foreign language learners. So, for example, if we had English speakers in a school in the UK learning Arabic, having never learned it before or encountered it before, as they might learn French in the classroom or Spanish. But also second language learners. So, for example, immigrants to an Arabic-speaking country. And then we also included heritage language learners who are studying Arabic in a non-Arabic speaking country, but they are studying it in they're learning it in an educational setting. So that would include, for example, children in England who they might speak a dialect at home are learning MSA at school, or maybe they're learning classical Arabic in the mosque. They would also have been included, but we didn't include. So, for example, heritage learners who are only learning it at home with no formal instruction, so they're only acquiring it naturalistically. And we also didn't include native Arabic speakers learning one standard Arabic in an Arabic-speaking country. So it was a bit of a difficult decision where to, what to include and what not to. But that's what we did it. That's how we did it. Sorry. Okay, there's another. Is that okay? Does that answer the question? Yeah, thanks. Okay. So can we talk more about an experimental approach? We're going to do exactly that after the break. We'll focus very much on that. So I'm going to postpone that for now because we will come back to that. Any other questions based on the scoping review, or actually I need to look in the Q&A and the chat, don't I? Don't think there's any in there. Okay. Either the scoping review or the PSP. We'd also be interested in your reactions to that, but well, both of those studies, but especially I'm interested in the priority setting partnership to see whether you would agree with the kinds of areas that came out as priorities, or whether there's anything you think is missing from that top 10 that would also be interesting.
Scroll back to the top 10 actually, so let's keep it on there. Or perhaps I'll do it quicker. Okay. Can you see that yet?
I can see that, yeah.
Great.
Yeah, so if anybody had any thoughts as to what, I don't know, from your perspective, is there anything there you wouldn't have expected, or anything that you think, or why isn't that there? That would be actually useful to know. But this is what the participants in our study came up with. This is how it got distilled down. Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions or comments in the chat, I think. So if that's the case, if nobody wants to ask anything, I guess we'll move on to a short break and then resume afterwards, where we will focus for a while on experimental studies and then talk about quality assessing Arabic research. So shall we take a 10-minute break, Hamish, at that point?
That sounds great. So if we could all be reconvened by 1700 British summer GMT, beg your pardon, or British summertime. Where are we?
No,
British summertime. So
yeah.
Let's start. Let's say we'll start on the dot at 5 o'clock.
5 o'clock.
yeah, we'll start on the hour.
So in 10
Great.
minutes. Okay, 10
Thanks,
minutes.
everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
think we'll just wait till it is exactly 5, just in case anyone's coming back on the dot. Okay, Hamish, are we good to go?
That's great. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. It's 5 o'clock. So now for hour 2. Enjoy.
Thank you. Just actually a couple of follow-up comments. First of all, if anyone did have any questions as we go along, just please continue to pop them in the chat or the Q&A. The difference between them is that the chat has your name attached if you've got one, if you're a registered user, I think, whereas the Q&A is anonymous, so you can set it to be anonymous. So if you prefer to ask a question anonymously, you can do that in the Q&A. And the other thing I suppose we should have said at the end of the first half is that between the scoping review showing where gaps are in evidence and the PSP showing what stakeholders think are their priorities for research, sort of at the intersection of those two things, where the gaps are and what people think they really want to know, I guess that gives us a good idea of where we might want to focus our research efforts if we want to have an impact on the classroom. Okay, so for the second part, we're going to look at some features of high quality research in general and in Arabic specifically. And we're going to do this to begin with anyway, by sharing some of the insights from another one of our, this time an in-depth systematic review. We've been doing a lot of systematic reviewing to try to understand what evidence there is so far to provide a basis for further work. So we're going to talk about some of the findings of our systematic review into speaking, teaching and learning of speaking in particular in Arabic. Okay, so as we saw in the scoping review, we had two broad categories of research, quantitative and qualitative. And we're going to mention both of those later. But for the purposes of this scoping review, we focused in particular on experimental studies. And so there was a question saying, can we say more about experimental design? So we very much will do that now. So by an experimental design, we mean a study in which one or more variables are manipulated, in other words, changed, which would be the treatment or the intervention. And then any effects on other variables, the outcomes are measured to try to establish whether there's a causal relationship at play. So it might be, for example, if we teach X, oh, sorry, Anna-Maria, I've got some more on that one. It might be if we teach X, will this have an impact on Y? If we teach phonics, will this improve reading comprehension? And as you can see from our image there, it's sort of modeled on the medical idea of a randomized controlled trial, which we all got familiar with from COVID times, where you would take a pool of volunteers, you'd randomly allocate them into two groups. One group get the pill X, and the other group gets something which looks identical, tastes identical, smells identical, the placebo. And then we measure down the line, we measure, is there maybe a reduction in occurrence or effects of a particular illness, why? So the reason, next one, please. The reason we chose this research design to focus on was that we felt, well, this is the design, or this is the study type which aims at least to give the most direct guidance to practitioners. It has the most direct link to a classroom, because it's attempting to say, what works in a classroom, what works when teaching Arabic. We'll problematize that a bit in a moment, but it's often referred to as a gold standard for establishing causal relationships. And following the medical model, the aim is to isolate the variable of interest and control for other factors. So, for example, if we're teaching phonics and we have one group getting phonics and the other not, we don't want, for example, one of the groups to also have a load of extensive reading, which might also affect their reading outcomes. And we also want to reduce or remove bias. So to give an example, if you've got a piece of action research where the teacher has developed a particular approach and wants to know if it works, they're heavily invested in it, they try it out in their classroom, they investigate it. Even if only subconsciously, they may be biased towards that intervention, they may invest more in it. Now, there have been calls over perhaps the last 20 years or so, Hamish might correct me on that, but for there to be more RCTs, more experimental studies in education to try to inform policy making and practice, to try and tell us, in inverted commas, big inverted commas, what works. In the UK, the EEF, the Education Endowment Foundation, has really promoted the use of experimental studies and RCTs, and has also synthesized evidence from them in research syntheses. And they've produced this teaching and learning toolkit. I've just taken a screenshot from it here just to show you how they present that evidence. So they summarize the evidence in a particular area in terms of how much it costs, how much evidence is out there, and what, on average, what the impact is. So you can see here for oral language interventions, it's very low in cost. There's lots and lots of studies researching this area, evaluating these interventions, and on average, it will have an impact of 6 months of extra progress for children who receive that intervention. By contrast, the next one down in the list, which is an area very dear to my own heart, as something I'm very involved in, but unfortunately for outdoor adventure learning, the summary says it's high in cost, pretty high cost, moderate cost. There's very little evidence actually evaluating it, and on average, there's no evidence that it makes any difference. So it's a guide to try to help people decide, if we've got limited resources in school, where should we invest them? Okay. However, there are problems. This idea that it's like a medical trial where you have a drug and a placebo which are identical is actually difficult in education. It's difficult to individually randomize people to one group or another because, for one thing, learners are usually in classes. I mean, of course, you can do this with some technology-based interventions, for example. You can individually randomize, but often we're looking at what should happen in a classroom. And you can't teach phonics to a few people in a class and not the others. You can't tell the others to sort of close their eyes for a bit and not listen. The true blinding of conditions is difficult. The idea that you have a placebo which looks and tastes the same. Well, the teaching approaches don't look and taste the same. So, teachers will know if they're teaching phonics or doing something different from usual. The learners will be aware of that. And moreover, teachers and the learners have agency, and they may react to the intervention in a particular way. They may not like it and actually not invest in it very much, or they may even subvert it. And so it's actually difficult in some ways to use this medical analogy. Moreover, when we think about this question of what works, that's also problematic in some ways, because a randomized control trial or an experimental study will determine in advance, this is what we're measuring, these are the outcomes we're measuring, but there will be many other things which aren't measured. And so what if, for example, a phonics intervention, what if it improves reading subskills, but actually turns children off reading and they get very negative about reading and read less? So that would be an unintended consequence, which might not actually be measured in the study. Another reason for caution is that what works on average may well not work in a particular classroom. So it's not like a monoculture of crops where they're all the same. And so if we administer X amount of fertilizer, they'll all grow amount Y. In fact, there's this wonderful diversity of individual learners and teachers, classrooms and schools. And so what works on average may not work at all in one particular setting. And so our view would be that teachers always need to make professional judgments in context and not actually be told what to do. That's also important, we would say, for teachers' sense of professionalism and agency. But we would say there's always a need for teachers to make contextualized judgments. And for that, all kinds of different research will be valuable to inform that. I don't know if there's a bullet point there. There will always, but all kinds of research can be valuable in informing teachers' professional judgments. So what we don't want to do, or we certainly didn't want to do in our systematic review by prioritizing experimental studies, is suggest that they're somehow the only valuable studies or that they're at the top of a pecking order. We do think they're very valuable if well conducted, but we don't want to imply that they're the only kind of research which is valuable. Okay, next slide, please. So then I think it is that. Oh, it's this one. Sorry. Okay. So taking that medical model, the key features of a rigorous experimental design might be, first of all, that there is a control or comparison group which doesn't get the intervention, because otherwise we're not isolating the teaching intervention. If we only have a group that gets the phonics and they get better at reading, maybe they would have got better anyway. So we have to have a comparator. We have to, what about the group which didn't get it? Do they make the same progress or less progress or more even? Secondly, the random assignment of participants. The groups would be a feature of a rigorous design, in that Individuals are all different, and we want to try to equalize those differences across the groups as far as possible. So in a reading intervention, for example, some children will have higher motivation for reading, some will have higher working memory, some will speak other languages at home, and so on. And we want those differences not all to be concentrated in one group, so we want them to be spread across the groups evenly, ideally. We want to test the dependent variable, the outcome, both before and after. If we only test it afterwards, say we find there's a difference between two groups at post-test, so after the intervention, if we didn't measure their performance at pre-test, before the intervention, maybe one group was already better than the other by chance. So pre-test and post-test is good. And ideally, that would include a longer-term follow-up, because sometimes you might see that an intervention has an effect in the short term, but then that washes out over time. In which case, again, that changes the balance of the equation in terms of, is this actually worth us investing our precious teaching time in? And finally, a rigorous design would involve blinding of participants and experimenters to which group the participants are in. And we have said that is problematic, but when it comes to, say, marking, say if everybody does a post-test, when that's marked, people marking it really shouldn't know who was in which group, in case they have some even subconscious bias making them treat one group more favorably than the other. So we summarized the design with this diagram, which I'll just let you have a few seconds just to look through that, rather than talk it all through. But we did this as a sort of template of what an ideal study might look like. So, and then we did similar ones for the studies in our review, so we could compare and see where the differences arose. So if I just give 10 seconds just to scan through the diagram. Hopefully that all makes sense. Okay, we move on, Anna-Maria. Now, one of the things we then did in our systematic review was to quality assess these studies, because we wanted to know how strong is the evidence that these studies provide. And for that, we used a tool called Goddard's sieve, we used a version published in 2014. There is an update now, but when we did this, we were using the 2014 version. And the sieve is a tool quite widely used to evaluate the rigor of experimental designs. And one thing we think it's useful to do when we are doing our own research is to think forward to the day when hopefully our study gets picked up in a search for a systematic review and gets quality assessed. And we want it to get as many stars as possible, or be assessed as high quality as possible, so that its evidence is treated as trustworthy, and so that it then contributes to these syntheses of evidence and makes a positive contribution, rather than someone saying, well, actually, that really didn't give us much value. So Goddard's sieve, but we will also problematize this tool in a moment. So Goddard's sieve has 6 categories, and in each category you can get between 0 and 4 stars. First of all, design, how are the groups allocated? Scale, how many participants per group? And if you're allocating classes, say if you're doing a study where some classes get, or some schools get a treatment and some don't, that is how many classes or schools per group. It's not just how many pupils overall, because pupils are clustered in classes. Dropout, how many people dropped out? That's important, because if a lot of people drop out of an intervention, maybe it's actually not very workable in practice. But also, more worryingly, people may drop out more from one group than another, or people of certain characteristics may drop out more from one group than another. So, for example, it would be problematic if lots of lower prior retainers dropped out of one intervention. And then when we get to the post-test, that would bias the outcomes. So we have to document any dropout. Outcomes, a really key thing is how valid are the outcome measures. By valid, we just mean, does it measure what it intends to measure? If you say you're measuring reading comprehension, are you really measuring reading comprehension? How are you defining that? Does the way you've defined it match how you're measuring it? Fidelity is basically how faithfully people do, or how faithfully people implement the intervention. So I keep going back to phonics because it's my research area, but if you say you're teaching phonics, is it really, do the teachers really do it? And do they really do it in the way that you've intended? And do the teachers in the comparison group not teach phonics, or are they actually just by chance deciding to do a bit of phonics? That would also skew the results. And finally, are there any other threats to validity? So, for example, an example of that might be that you have two groups of pupils in the same school. One gets a particular intervention, another doesn't, but they talk at break time and they share the materials. And so, again, you get sort of leaching across the conditions. So, for Gorard to get 4 stars is quite a big ask. So on the next slide, see, hopefully that's going to move on. Yep, you'd have to have an RCT, large in scale, with no dropout. You'd have to use standardized tests. You'd have to have the intervention delivered uniformly and exactly faithfully as intended, and there'd have to be no other threats to validity. And if all of those things are true, you'd get 4 stars. Note that if in Gorard's sieve, if you don't describe something, if you don't mention, say, dropout or fidelity to condition, it is automatically scored 0. And the overall score is equal to the lowest individual score in any one category. So you can see it's actually a very stringent tool, but it's worth remembering. I mean, it's not the only tool out there, but it is a widely used one. And it's certainly worth remembering, I think, that if you don't describe something, it will be scored as 0. And that's something, again, we'll come back to. Okay, so that sets us up now for Anna-Maria to tell you about some of these studies, or at least one study in our review.
Thank you. Okay, so we've sort of looked at the sort of fundamentals of experimental research and the tool that we use to quality assess the studies that appeared in our systematic review. So what we're going to do now is a deep dive into one of these empirical research studies in order to show how we assessed a particular study and how that framework was applied in order for us to draw out implications for creating our own high quality research. So, as we've mentioned, we conducted a systematic review of speaking studies. We drew on the studies that we found in our scoping review, and we also conducted an updated search for the period of 2003 to 2004. This was done last year to make sure we hadn't missed any studies. We put these studies through a rigorous process of abstract review and full text review, which we iterated. And as you know, we focused particularly on experimental studies. And in total, out of the sort of over 500 studies that we found related to speaking, only 10 of them were experimental studies. 5 of these focused particularly on phonology, and 5 of them focused on broader or more general speaking skills. And we're going to draw on one of these other studies for our snapshot. So as a reminder, this is our sort of template for what an experimental study should look like. You're starting with your sample, pre-testing in order to determine the equivalence of the groups that you then assign your participants to. You have an experimental group and a comparator group and or control group, and you follow the intervention with a post-test and ideally a delayed post-test. So these are the features that we're looking for in an experimental study, in our case, looking at speaking. So as I said, we found 5 studies. They ranged in terms of their focus. Some of them looked at online learning. Some of them looked at the relationship between a role play, treatment, and dialogue skills. 2 studies focused, interestingly, on the acquisition of future grammatical forms in the Levantine dialect, which we thought was particularly interesting. One of them focused on the acquisition of these forms and anxiety, and the final study focused on class size. And we're going to be looking in depth now at study 4. So what did this study look like? We've put this into our template to see how it compares to the sort of archetypical experimental design. So in terms of study focus, this examined the interaction between 3 different things: task type, so treatment, the noticing and production of grammatical forms, specific grammatical forms and grammatical forms in general in the Levantine dialect, and foreign language anxiety. So you can see the research questions there. The sample that was included in this experiment were 80 adult learners, but they were already grouped into 6 intact classes before the experiment began. So these were pre-existing classes. They were all studying Arabic as a foreign language or a heritage language. The sample did include 3 learners from Arab descent, and other learners had varied first language backgrounds. The sample was split pretty evenly between males and females, and these students were studying at a university in the USA in an intensive course which focused on MSA and dialects. So this sample was split, not individually, but 3 classes were randomly assigned to each treatment. So what did these 2 treatments look like? The experimental group, if you like, were given output and input. So they were engaged in a treatment that lasted 2 hours, and this involved the oral description of a picture-cued story. So learners heard an oral description of a particular story. I think it was about their weekend. They read a description, and then they underlined various grammatical forms in that description. And then they were asked, this is where the oral output comes in, they were asked to re-describe the pictures in their own words in Arabic. So that's why they're called the output input group, because they received and engaged in both of those formats. The comparator group was input only, so they also received a 2-hour treatment. They only, however, answered pretext exposure questions, so in writing. They listened to, read, and underlined a model description, the same as the experimental group. And they answered post-text exposure questions, again, writing, so they were not engaged in any oral output. So experimental group, oral output, input-only group heard the story being read and wrote the story in their own words. What were the forms that were under investigation? So what exactly was being examined? Now, as I said, this study did look at the noticing and use of grammatical forms in general in the Levantine dialect, but the 3 target forms were all related to the future tense. So there is the future tense prefix that they were interested in. So for example, in the sentence, بكرة الصبح أشرب قهوة, so that ha, which translates roughly into the word will in English, was a feature of interest. Time-telling phrases, a sa something, so whatever o'clock is used in the text, and time connectors, so words like ba'dain, so later. So those were the 3 areas of particular focus. How were these measured? So this relates now to our post-test. Learners were asked to give verbal reports of grammatical forms they noticed, and of those, it was noted whether or not they had mentioned these future tense forms, but they also underwent paper-based tests and oral tests. So they were asked to underline forms that were salient to them. And again, the authors examined whether or not they had picked up on those future tense forms. And they were asked to respond to a prompt about their upcoming weekend verbally. And the researchers examined whether or not they had integrated those particular target forms in their own oral production. So in addition to those post-tests, the researchers also implemented the Foreign Language Classroom Anxiety Scale, which is a survey that measures learners' anxiety. The hypothesis was that the output group would be more prone to anxiety effects, so they would have higher anxiety and wouldn't perform as well as a result of the fact that they were asked to speak, which the authors posit would be more anxiety-inducing. This post-test and the Foreign Language Classroom Anxiety Scale was repeated 2 weeks after the original post-test to see whether or not the effects of the treatment continued or diminished. So what did this particular study find? As I said, it is quite an interesting study. Overall, in terms of the noticing and production of forms, in terms of general grammatical forms, so grammatical forms of any type, the noticing and integration, that's what they've called production, of grammatical forms in general, were correlated on both post-tests, so the original post-test and the delayed post-test. And the noticing and use of future tense forms were also positively correlated, again on both post-tests, though the correlation weakened between the tests. However, these were results for the sample overall, so the 80 students in total. There was no advantage either in noticing or in the integration on either post-test for the treatment group that engaged in oral activities or the group that engaged only in listening and reading and writing. So there was no statistical difference between the groups when it came to noticing and integration of forms in general or future tense form. In terms of anxiety, this is where the findings do get quite interesting. Higher levels of anxiety were positively associated with the noticing and integration of grammatical forms in general. So the authors had posited the opposite, that the group who engaged in output would see an increase and that would affect their scores negatively, but that was not what they found. However, when it came to the future tense forms, there was no association between foreign language anxiety and future tense forms in particular. But there was no significant difference found between these groups regarding the impact of foreign language anxiety and their ability to notice and produce these forms. So when we come to assess this particular study, we're not looking only at the limitations of the study, we also draw upon the strengths of this study. And as I've said already, this was a fascinating piece of experimental research. And its strengths include the fact that it focused on Levantine Arabic, which is a gap, as we've already seen in the research. There is a mismatch between the levels of research on modern standard Arabic and dialects. The study also finds an interesting link, a tentative link, between foreign language anxiety and the noticing and use of grammatical forms in general, which was unexpected. So it does contribute to the literature, again, tentatively. Methodologically, some of the strengths include the fact that they made use of a validated instrument. So they didn't design their own instrument untested to measure foreign language anxiety. They used the FLCAS, which has been used across a wide variety of language learning contexts and has been validated. The inclusion of a delayed post-test is also a strength of this study. They measured not only whether the treatment conditions had an impact immediately, but also whether or not that impact remained over time. A range of statistical analyses were used by the authors, and noticeably they were described well, which counts in their favour when it comes to assessing the quality of this study. And finally, because the scoring of some of the tests involved some judgment calls, especially when it came to the integration of forms, the researchers iterated their scoring. So it wasn't this sort of protected against the idea that it's just one person's subjective judgment of whether or not an answer is correct. This was corroborated by an independent rater. So these are all strengths of this particular study. When it comes to limitations, this is where the stars start to fall. Some of these are inherent to the fact that this study was conducted in a classroom, but others are due to the way that the study was described, and we'll talk a little bit about the differentiation between those types of limitations later. So we've already seen that the ideal is for individual randomization of participants. In this case, randomization was employed, but it was of intact classes. So rather than there being 40 individually randomized cases in each treatment group, you have essentially 3 cases of clustered students. And there was no pretest to determine the equivalence of these groups, whether or not they had the same proficiency levels, whether or not they had the same levels of anxiety to begin with, whether or not they had the same levels of noticing and integration of grammatical forms in general and of the future tense forms in particular. So we can't compare and determine how effective, in fact, that treatment was because we have no pre-test scores to compare to. There was also no description of participants in each group, although we had quite rich descriptions of the participants overall, the overall sample. It's not clear whether or not they were equal numbers of learners with different profiles in both of those groups. So whether or not gender learners were divided equally in terms of gender, in terms of first language background, whether or not the heritage learners that were included were clustered in one classroom, whether they were spread across the treatments. And the inclusion of heritage learners in this study, although not in studies in general, was problematic. Although the authors did sort of verbally ask students whether or not they had any familiarity with the future tense in dialects, the fact that there are heritage learners who possibly have exposure to similar forms in their own dialects was problematic because they would already be at an advantage when it comes to the noticing and integration of this particular feature of focus. The authors also note that there were different instructors in each section. So the treatments were not delivered by the same person, which introduces possible teacher effects. So it's possible that the development of those classes or the efficacy of the treatments is partly, potentially, down to how it was delivered. And the character of the teacher and the engagement levels that they're able to sort of encourage. The authors also acknowledged that they were only able to deliver a single treatment session, and this may possibly be insufficient to actually sort of promote the noticing and integration of the future tense forms in the Levantine dialect. So ideally, this treatment would have been longer than just a single 2-hour session. There is, interestingly, also an issue with the test foci, so the way that the forms were presented potentially in the text. And this calls into question the validity of the instruments that were used to test the noticing, in particular, of the future tense forms. So what do I mean by this? So if we go back to the example sentence, which is بكرة الصبح اشرب قهوة, in this particular sentence, you've got the sort of competition between two future tense forms. You've got بكرة الصبح, which already puts that sentence in the future tense. And then you've got the ha, which adds, situates the verb in particular in the future tense, but in some cases is redundant, because in Arabic you don't have to include the future tense prefix to indicate the future. It can be done through context. And it can mean also, because learners are focusing already on that word, which situates something in the future, this sort of decreases the salience of the ha in comparison to a case in which they had been presented in separate sentences. Perhaps learners would have noticed that ha had it not been sort of prefaced by a time phrase already. So that calls into question the validity of these particular instruments. While it was the case that scores were interrated, which is a strength, as we've said, the actual scoring methods described were unclear. And as such, it's going to be very difficult for us to determine whether it was a valid approach to scoring. And if somebody wanted to replicate this study in another setting, it would be almost impossible to do so. So as a result, this study was evaluated as a 1-star study. Now, as we've said, there are some issues, particularly when it comes to classroom research, with this scoring. But what that means in practical terms is that we need to be careful when reading the conclusions of such studies, and if we're writing these studies ourselves, to make sure that our conclusions align with the strength and the scope of our study. So this study actually did a good job of expressing their conclusions in sort of cautious and nuanced terms. So if we read an extract from their conclusion, this states that some level of foreign language anxiety may not be as debilitating as traditionally thought, so it may actually help. A positive language learning environment ensuring more facilitative foreign language levels would seem to be key in this endeavour. That's sort of phrasing is suitable for a study of this scope and of this strength. This is in comparison to other studies which also ranked as 1-star studies. So study 2, for example, if we read this, we'll find that they're much more emphatic in the conclusions that they draw, despite the fact that it is limited by several methodological and theoretical issues. So for study 2, the authors expressed that the results emphasize the need to introduce role play as an effective method for enhancing dialogue skills, since the traditional methods do not have any significant role in improving dialogue skills. It's not possible to make such emphatic statements and to draw such emphatic conclusions from a study that expresses that has been assessed as a one-star study. So making sure that our conclusions, we'll come back to this point later, fit with the scope of our study is very important when it comes to quality assessment.
Okay, I think that's back to me, Anna-Maria.
Yes.
Yep. Okay, yeah, so I'm just going to sort of recap, I suppose, and amplify some of those points. So, on the previous slide, we saw all of the studies in the other speaking category came out with 1 star, so a low rating on Goddard's sieve. But we just really want to emphasize that we don't think that means those studies are without value by any means. And there are different reasons why you might, as Anna-Maria said, there's different reasons why you might slip down the star rating scale that Goddard uses. Some of those are avoidable. So, for example, if you use a test which isn't a valid test, you're not actually measuring the construct you hope to measure. That's something that actually could have been avoided with careful thought or piloting or analysis. Similarly, the lack of pretests is something which presumably could have been avoided without too much extra resources. On the other hand, some limitations, some reasons for reducing the star rating in Goddard are less avoidable. For example, particularly the scale of a study, because that depends on your time, resources, financial resources. So we can't all conduct large-scale RCTs with a nationally representative sample. I mean, that's beyond most of our reach. So we wanted to propose this sort of mountain analogy. And again, some of you will have seen this before from our talks. But if you could see the 4-star in Goddard's system, 4-star study as being a bit like Everest, like it's the biggest mountain you could climb. It's difficult to climb. It requires a huge amount of effort, training, technical expertise, resources, time, finances, a support team, a base camp. It's a difficult thing to do, and so not many people can do that. To illustrate that, we did a few years ago, so together with colleagues, I was involved in a rapid evidence assessment for the EEF. And in that study, we had 138 studies included. And you can see there from the chart that actually only 2 of them got 4 stars in Goddard's sieve, whereas 50 of them got 0, and a large number got 1 or 2 stars. So, I mean, what I think this tells us is that we don't, or what we want to emphasize is that we don't think that just because the study scores low, it doesn't mean it's not valuable. If you don't mind moving on, Anna-Maria. What it does mean is, as Anna-Maria has said, is that the scope of the claims you make have to match the scale of the study. So if you have managed to conduct an Everest type study, a large-scale RCT with a nationally representative sample, that will support implications for policy, maybe at a national level. If you've conducted a piece of action research or some classroom research, which is much smaller scale, it may actually still be very well conducted, very rigorous, robust, and be valuable, but it won't support implications at that sort of large national scale. It might support implications for a particular classroom or school. It may nonetheless generate ideas which can inform practice more widely. I mean, actually, the study 4 that Anna-Maria talked through is a good example. That idea is a challenging thought that some degree of anxiety might be good. That's something that makes you think. There may be other studies which do have methodological limitations or are limited in scope, but which give you ideas for things that could be tried out in the classroom. But the main thing, as Anna-Maria said, is that the conclusions, the implications you draw match the the evidential warrant that you've managed to generate. And from another systematic review that we conducted into studies on writing, we've got this quite nice example of where a very small scale study taught paragraph writing skills to a group of 15 learners. So a very small scale study. There was no control group. The way the students' output was graded wasn't explained, and there were no statistics involved. And yet the conclusions were that this study has policy level implications for paragraph writing. The policy level implications underline the need, again that word, the need to introduce learner-centric language teaching methods in higher education. So a very large scope of claim based on actually evidence that doesn't warrant that scope of claim. So I think probably out of the presentation, that's for us the key message. And we read a lot of studies where there was this mismatch between the scope or quality of the evidence and the claims that were made. So pursuing this mountain analogy, you can walk up hills of different sizes, and that can be. I hope people like this mountain analogy, because it really works for me. But then again, I'm a mountain lover, but you can walk up hills of different scales, different sizes, and no matter how small the hill, you can have it can be a very valuable and enriching experience. And just because someone else has climbed Everest, it doesn't mean that there's no value in climbing a smaller hill. And in fact, there's value. You can learn a lot from a walk in the woods at sea level. As long as you can learn a lot about the plants around you, the flora and the fauna, as long as you adopt a careful, a systematic and a thorough approach to your observations and analysis. But what you can't do in the woods at sea level is see the wider view. So you can't make claims about the wider landscape around you. You can make claims about the things you can see. The higher you climb, the further you can see. So in this analogy, the larger the scale, the greater the scope of the claims you can make. But then also, in order to do that, you will need to put in more time, more effort. You'll need more resources, expertise, equipment, probably support. And once you get to the highest mountains, actually, for many of us, they're not going to be accessible without a large, probably international team. But at that altitude, you can see a vast distance, and you can make claims, perhaps about policy on a national level. But that doesn't mean that smaller scale studies, carefully conducted, rigorously implemented, are without value. Okay, Anna-Maria, back to you.
So speaking of rigorously conducted studies, we're going to look now at the broader sort of paradigms of qualitative and quantitative studies, and look at how other types of studies might be assessed. So in our current systematic review that we're conducting, which focuses on the motivation of Arabic language learners, we used a different tool to Gorad's sieve that was exclusively for experimental studies. And this was developed by Komet, I think I'm saying that right, Komet and colleagues, and was published in 2004. And it's known as the Standard Quality Assessment Criteria for evaluating primary research papers from a variety of fields. So we thought this was a good fit for the motivation studies that we identified. So we're going to talk through a little bit about what this particular quality assessment framework looks like in order to hopefully provide us with some pointers even before we begin our research or at any stage of the research we might find ourselves at, pointers as to how to ensure that we are not only conducting quality research, but that we are producing quality output, so quality journal articles or reports of our research, because we hope one day that our research will be included in a systematic review. It will be of high enough quality to be able to have an impact in the field and to sort of have far-reaching implications. So Komet et al., this framework, provides us with two checklists for quality criteria, one for quantitative studies, for which there are 14 criteria, and one for qualitative studies, for which there are 10 criteria. And I've advised master's students recently, actually, before they even begin their research, to have a look at these quality criteria before they conduct any data collection, before they design their instruments, to make sure that they are hitting these from the get-go. For each of these criteria, you are awarded a number of points. So if that criteria is fully met, you get 2 points. If it's partially met, you get 1 point. And if it's not met, then you get 0 points. And this is totaled at the end, and you have a final score that determines the quality of your study. So this is what we're using for our current systematic review. So what we're going to do is, as I said, we're going to do a deep dive now into not a particular study, but these some of these specific criteria, which we found in reviewing Arabic literature, or research on Arabic language learning, have come up as sort of red flags over and over again. So we hope this will be a useful reminder to us when we're producing our own research, and hopefully to you as well. The first criteria is obviously defining and describing your objective. Research studies generally do this well, but probably the first important point relates to study design and ensuring that this is both evident in the write-up of your study and that it's appropriate. So by appropriate, we mean that it aligns with your research questions. So does the design of your study allow you to answer those questions effectively? So if you are looking at sort of causational relationships, have you adopted and described a design that will enable you to make those inferences from the data? So is it a longitudinal study, for example, or have you employed analyses that will enable you not to look at correlations only, but causational relationships? So that's the sort of foundation of any study, is a good research design. The second, and possibly the most important quality criteria that we found studies sort of fall at or struggle with, is a description of participants. Now, this sounds very straightforward, but actually there is a lot of information that we find is missing about participants. It's important to know who is being studied as much as it is important to know what is being studied in a particular journal article or thesis. Why is it important? Because we can't assess how generalizable the study is without this information. We can't determine whether or not the findings of a particular research would apply to another context if we don't know the details of that particular sample. So we've come up with a list of what we think are the minimum requirements for Arabic studies to include in descriptions of samples. And it doesn't matter how you do this, but all of this information is really vital when assessing the generalizability of a study and its quality overall. So these include age, obvious one, gender, often missed, first languages of your participants, and potentially, thinking about Arabic, other languages spoken. So if you are conducting research in the UK, for example, you might find that if you're researching in a school, that learners are speakers of English, but that they come from backgrounds where perhaps Urdu or Somali is spoken. And that knowledge of that language may give them an advantage which is otherwise hidden and may have affected your results, but we're not able to discern that as readers. Proficiency levels. And when we say proficiency levels, we mean be as specific as possible. So what is described as intermediate in one context may not mean intermediate in another context. So what we are looking for as readers is a valid and detailed, and as far as possible, description of the proficiency levels of our particular samples. The inclusion of heritage learners in our studies is also of huge importance. As we saw, the inclusion of heritage learners in the previous study could have impacted the results, but that wasn't acknowledged. But we found that several studies omit to include whether or not learners are of a heritage status. We'll come back to defining heritage learners later on. And one final one that applies particularly to Arabic is religious background. And this becomes quite a prominent issue when we're looking at studies of things like motivation, because learners who are coming from different religious backgrounds may have quite distinct motivational profiles, for example. So listing these in whatever form is possible in the write-up of your research is vital to assuring the quality of your research output. Moving on, defining your outcome measures is also of great importance. So what do we mean by this? Again, to take motivation as an example, because I'm immersed in motivation research at the moment, often you'll find that studies can say one thing and mean another. So this is a mistake that we don't want to be making ourselves. So one person's definition of motivation, even though they're using the same term, might be quite different to somebody else's definition of motivation. So how are you defining the constructs that you are measuring? And in addition to that, are the measures that you, or the instruments that you're using to measure these constructs valid? In essence, are they effective in capturing what the study is trying to find? Or is it sort of woolly? And we might actually be looking at something else or testing something that we didn't intend to test because our instruments are not valid or reliable. Analytical methods is also an important area to touch upon. So firstly, are your analytical methods described? And in terms of quantitative studies, this is usually done quite well. The issue arises when we think about the justification and appropriateness of analytical methods being employed. So this relates, for example, to issues such as whether or not parametric or non-parametric tests have been used. Have we as researchers tested our data for normality and homogeneity of variance before we've decided that we're going to do a t-test, for example? Another thing that crops up under this heading is the running of multiple t-tests. So have the researchers adjusted their p-values if they are running multiple t-tests? Not adjusting your p-value would be something that would affect the quality of our study. Because if we don't do that, obviously that introduces the possibility of type 1 error into our research. The next point that is important for us as researchers to reflect upon and to implement in our research is perhaps not necessarily the controlling for confounding variables, because often we can't control many variables in classroom settings, for example. But the acknowledging of confounding variables is also something that translates into a higher quality study. So are there teacher effects, for example, students' backgrounds? This also relates back to the description of participants, class size, the time of day, even if that emerged as something that you noticed might have had a difference on the findings of your study. Have we acknowledged variables that may have influenced what we found? And finally, we've mentioned this point before, but just to emphasize its importance, are our conclusions supported by our results? So it can be tempting to think, yes, I found something really, really interesting, and therefore everybody should do it, and this is an important finding. And this by no means diminishes the importance of your finding. But if your conclusions are overstatements, sort of emphatic declarations of, you know, the fact that this will change the teaching of Arabic across the world, those sort of statements impact the quality assessment of a particular study. So that's an easy fix. By making sure that your conclusions are supported by the results ensures that you do score higher on these quality assessment criteria. So those were to do with quantitative research in particular. To look briefly at qualitative research, in addition to defining our participants, we also want to make sure that the context in which our study was carried out is clear. So that could be the classroom level, the school level, the sort of institutional level, and perhaps even the national level. And this allows for our readers to properly interpret the findings in the context of your study, and again, determine whether or not those findings might be generalizable. Data collection methods. This is something that again seems intuitive, but we find it's easy to fall into the trap of saying that interviews were employed or classroom observations without giving any more detail. And the reason that detail is necessary, so who conducted the interviews, how they were recorded, what language they were conducted in, how long they lasted, means again that your study is replicable. And we can determine also whether or not your study is valid. So a study that did sort of 5-minute interviews, but with 5 participants or even 20 participants, might not be able to access as much depth from their data as something, a study that did sort of multiple interviews over several weeks. The issue of data analysis is also something that's important to bear in mind when writing up and indeed conducting qualitative research. So have we documented the process by which we went from the data to arrive at our results? Again, often we find that papers will say things like, the data was coded. And that gives us an indication of what might have happened, but it doesn't give us a window into the step-by-step procedure that was followed, and it doesn't allow us any insight into how those codes were generated, how they were refined, and how somebody might replicate that study using your same approach. Linked to this idea of data analysis is the use of verification procedures. So we saw in our sample study that the authors iterated their scoring methods. This can also be done, and ideally we should also do this for our qualitative data to ensure that it's the codes that we generate, the findings that we present are a reflection of the data and not our own subjective interpretations. Are the conclusions supported by the results? We can't reiterate that enough. But finally, in terms of qualitative studies, reflexivity of the account is very important. What was our role in the research? How might our own identity, beliefs, background have influenced the results? And it's not to say it's a terrible thing if it influences the results. Again, there are things that are out of our control, but reflecting on that, again, increases the quality rating of your particular study. So we want to look very briefly, I realize we're running out of time a little bit, at considerations for research in general. So just to summarize these. So firstly, define. Please define. We need to remember to define our terms. What are we measuring? What are we exploring? Describe in detail methods of recruitment, the learning context, instruments used. These should be replicable from your methods. We want to avoid reinventing the wheel where existing validated tools exist. Can they be modified or adapted rather than producing yet another survey that may not actually be a valid instrument? What is our role in the research? So reflecting critically on our underlying assumptions and how we may have influenced findings, and being aware, again, this theme again of being aware of overstating our claims. Now, Robert mentioned earlier, so I won't dwell too much on this point, that not all limitations are equal. There are some potentially unavoidable limitations that are imposed by context. So limited sample size, limited resources, there's not much we can do about those, particularly in classroom settings. But there are avoidable limitations, and these are fixable. These are areas where we can enhance our own research in order to ensure that our output is of a high quality, is included in systematic reviews, and has an impact in the field. So these sort of red flags that we've raised earlier, avoiding those as much as possible can help us boost the quality of our research. So I want to end by looking at considerations for Arabic research in particular. So the first point to consider when we are conducting Arabic research is what we mean by the term Arabic. Not everyone will have the same understanding of that term as you. To a heritage learner, it might mean one thing. To someone coming from a religious background, it might mean another. So what do your participants understand by Arabic? And when it comes to researching things such as motivation, this is really important. If you ask someone, what are your attitudes? Let's talk about attitudes. What are your attitudes towards studying Arabic? That might mean two very different things to participants. We're using the same term. So there could be a conflation of ideas or issues with the fact that we're not actually talking about the same thing. And specifying the variety of the language that is being learned or taught in your study context is of vital importance. We already saw that 40% of studies in our scoping review did not include the variety that was being taught. Selecting, defining your participants. We've talked about the minimum requirements for Arabic studies. What should you include? Be explicit. All other things to consider are whether your learners are taking Arabic as a compulsory subject or learning it through their own volition. This can impact things like engagement, motivation, even proficiency. So have you told the reader, have we told the reader whether or not learners are there through choice in the classroom? When we are investigating heritage language learners, it's important for us to provide the reader with an insight as to how we are defining a heritage learner, because in the field of Arabic language research, there are multiple definitions. Again, this relates to the replicability and generalizability of our findings. The reason that documenting participants' first language, as we said, is important is because learners who speak languages such as Urdu or Somali, perhaps, may have an advantage over learners who speak only English. So they may have shared scripts, they may have shared vocabulary items between their language and Arabic, which could give them an advantage. And it's important, as we've said already, to describe learners' language levels. When we're thinking about our instruments, it's important to think about whether we adopt, adapt, or develop our own instruments, whether they are valid and reliable, whether we have ourselves tested and examined the validity and reliability, or whether this has been done before us, for us. And it's also important to reflect on the appropriateness of these instruments for Arabic. So if you are conducting a vocabulary test, are you including diacritics or not? That needs sort of to have an informed judgment behind it. If you are examining phonology, how are you determining an error? Is colloquial pronunciation of a particular phonological utterance, if it's spoken as you would in dialect, is that wrong in your particular context? These need to be determined and described. And finally, how does your research align with the research priorities that teachers have identified? And in general, how does it align with learning and teaching, so practice and theory? So taken together, these considerations of how to conduct high quality research in general, and in particular in Arabic, hopefully will allow us to generate impactful research, yes, strengthened by sort of avoiding those common limitations, so that this research can be of use in promoting and underscoring the expansion of Arabic to ensure that it is effective for learners in all contexts. And I will stop there because I think we are just bang on time.
Thank you so much, Anna-Maria. We have actually run out of time for Q&A, I'm afraid. I know there's one in the chat which I've just answered in the chat, but we have unfortunately run out of time. Joe, are you still here? Because I know you had a... Ah, there you go. I know Joe's got to dash exactly at 6, but there's a link in the chat to a feedback form. We'd be very grateful for any feedback, and we hope it's been useful and interesting, certainly interesting for us to put together and to move from the systematic review into what that means for research going forwards. So just to say thank you all for attending, really, and we hope that's been useful, and we hope to see you at a future event as well. Thank you very much.